Well, welcome to this series of talks about George Whitefield and the Evangelical Revival. I'm going to take you back primarily to the England and Wales of the 18th century, and of course, in part, North America too. Now, of course, this revival, the term awakening is often used in the US, affected many of the English-speaking lands of North America and Northern Europe, and indeed, many of the revival preachers, not least both George Whitefield and John Wesley, travelled back and forth across the Atlantic. Perhaps too often. But news also travelled. The stories of conversion, the stories of outbreaks of revival, and indeed, even of doctrinal disputes. But above everything else, I want you to become part of this story. We will meet in these talks the key players, the methods which were used to proclaim the gospel, not least preaching in the open air, the doctrinal debates, the pioneers in several places, and of course, what happened as time went on. It's an exciting story. It's a time when the Lord truly walked the land of England, of Wales, of North America, and elsewhere. Come and join me in its telling. Now, the outbreak of what is now known as the Evangelical Revival was as surprising to its participants as it was to observers, had a profound and lasting effect on English culture and society, as well as on the church. Why did these events take place? What caused them? How different was the revival from the traditional Protestantism of the Reformation? Well, let's start with a few definitions and key features. The Evangelical Revival or Awakening is the name given to the series of events of intense religious fervour, local, regional, national and international, in the middle decades of the 18th century. And this revival had a number of distinguishing features and marks. The first of those was a recovery of profound piety in personal devotion. The early participants in the revival rose early and prayed deeply and often. The second feature was a rejection of superficiality in faith in favour of more substantial and substantive beliefs, and a new depth of self-examination. Sometimes it was very intense. It was certainly very personal. It was something meaningful. The focus was on the all-pervading impact of sin and then on thankfulness in response to what God had done. So John Wesley kept a diary indicating on a daily basis his grace rating, how he was doing. The third key feature is that there was a recovery of the doctrines of the Reformation, the essential beliefs of Protestantism. Other distinguishing features of the revival, perhaps not for the first time, but certainly in a newly distinctive way, resurgence of expectation of the experience of God in the believer's life, conversion, providence, and discipleship, together with a passion to bring the message of the faith to all. Revival was bound by neither geography nor social class. Well, the preaching of the new birth, the experience that is of conversion, was perhaps the typical defining feature of the revival. Conversion did not happen for the first time in this period, but perhaps it was that the experience moved more centre stage. So then the revival was characterised by relatively large numbers of people having a common experience of God's action in their heart in comparatively confined areas over a fairly short period of time. So intense experience of God in a confined area, large numbers of people, a relatively short period of time. Mark Noll refers to intense periods of unusual response to gospel preaching linked with unusual efforts at godly living. Thomas Kidd invests the meaning with a more spiritual explanation by referring to seasons of revival or outpourings of the Holy Spirit. Well, however you look at it, something significant was taking place. Something important, something major to large numbers of people over a short period of time. In short, God was at work. Well, the conversion of John Wesley, born in 1703, died in 1791, his conversion in 1738 is often seen as a convenient date with which to mark the beginning of the revival. However, key individuals had already undergone the distinguishing characteristic of evangelical faith, had already undergone the experience of conversion, including George Whitefield, 1714 to 1770, and in Wales, the crucial figure of Howell Harris, 1714 to 1773, and indeed Daniel Rowland, 1713 to 1790. Note the dates that I'm giving there, all encompassing these crucial decades of the 18th century. North America, Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 1758, had already overseen an outbreak of revival in the town of Northampton, Massachusetts, in 1734. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, the action of God in the heart did not distinguish between the social backgrounds of the recipients. And the revival was notable for a new intensity of religious conviction among both the poorest, the miners of the Kingswood area of Bristol, for example, and the best off in society, not least through the Countess of Huntingdon, 1707 to 1791, whom we will meet in a bit more detail later in this series. Equally socially disruptive to some were the rather unruly events that accompanied many of these outbreaks. An untidy cacophony of cries, swooning, and trances. Such phenomena caused division at their time in their interpretation, though generally there was a degree of healthy scepticism. Well, the revival in England, and indeed in Wales, took place both within and without the established church. The Church of England was built upon foundation documents, the 39 Articles of Religion, the Book of Common Prayer, and the Ordinal. And these doctrinal and liturgical writings, together with Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's Book of Homilies, that is, sermons, placed the Church of England firmly within the Calvinist traditions of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. However, the ebbs and flows of the history of the Church of England had left these key building blocks shrouded in a degree of mystery at best. For some clergy, the revival brought these roots back to prominence and was thus instrumental in establishing the moderate Calvinist tradition upon which Anglican Evangelicalism was built. For others, this was not so, represented more by the development of Methodism as a separate denomination towards the end of the 18th century. Also in England and in Wales, there was a tradition of religious dissent, that is, those who did not give their consent to the established church, sometimes called nonconformists. They too were affected by the revival. Isaac Watts, 1674 to 1748, the famous hymn writer, was a good example. But much of the main action took place within the Church of England. In North America, the dominant Presbyterianism was no less affected, indeed more so than the established church in the colonies. Those influenced by the awakenings were known as New Lights, those who resisted Old Lights. Well, let's turn and have a look at the state of religion in England in the early 18th century, which formed the context and the backdrop for this outbreak of revival. The picture is not a pretty one, but what is most extraordinary is that the decline of the nation and the decline of piety in the nation had set in so quickly after the deaths of the main Puritan pioneers in the 1680s and the 1690s. The state of faith had declined rapidly from the high point of the Commonwealth period, despite, on the face of it, the nation being saved from Catholicism by William of Orange taking the throne in 1688. What had happened? What had gone so terribly wrong. Well, firstly, the nation had fallen into a quagmire of sin. An early evangelical historian, G.R. Belaine, in his book, A History of the Evangelical Party, puts the case explicitly, if rather uncritically. The drunkenness of the age is proverbial, he said. The country squires were sodden with alcohol. Filth was regarded as the choicest form of wit. Well, there was unquestionably a moral malaise which ran through the heart of the nation. This malaise also affected the church. Belaine argued that only the cautious and colourless remained, Laodiceans whose ideal church was neither hot nor cold. The church, he said, had forgotten its mission, was unscriptural, discredited and useless. Well, it's certainly true that the earlier Puritan fervour had passed away, and rather quickly. Clergy were more interested in wine and hunting than preaching the gospel, more interested in money than faithfulness. They would gather numerous church responsibilities together, known as livings, collecting the associated payments, known as tithes, but neglecting their duties. Many lived elsewhere and rarely visited their parishes. These characteristics were known as plurality, gathering many livings together, and non-residency, living in a different, and probably to them rather more agreeable place. Both were rife. Even if the minister conducted worship, there was little food for the soul. The sermons had become long, very long, up to 3 hours in length was not unusual. Dry, arid, moralistic ramblings. Nothing for the heart and nothing for the soul. No wonder that George Whitefield and Howell Harris railed against the carnal clergy. No wonder the church reacted against Whitefield and others as disruptors, revolutionaries, or simply enthusiasts. So, one important backdrop to the revival is to see the revival as essentially a reaction to the condition of society and faith in the early 18th century. The day was dark, the embers of faith were low. It was time for God to act, and God would not be mocked. Indeed, part of this reaction was the development of new means of evangelism in the revival, open-air preaching and itinerancy. You see, one of the driving passions or convictions of the converted Christian is that people must hear the gospel. And if they do not hear the gospel preached in the church, then it must be proclaimed outside of the church. And the proclamation of the new birth or spiritual regeneration required because of human sin and depravity was central to the revival's methodology. The long, dry sermons were now transformed by spiritual vitality and preaching to the heart as much as to the intellect. And also, in contrast to the usual model of preaching in a church, the practice of itinerancy developed. That is, the preacher or evangelist travelling from place to place to speak to large crowds, often in the open air. Well, the picture was in reality somewhat more complicated. Some of the pioneers of revival adopted the principle of itinerancy, while others remained faithful to the parish boundaries. William Grimshaw, who we will meet later on, practiced itinerancy. Samuel Walker of Truro remained faithful to the parish boundaries. And itinerancy was controversial within the established church, viewed with suspicion and disdain. Without the permission of the incumbent, it was technically illegal to preach in that minister's parish. For most of the early revival preachers, though, when the pulpits were closed, the fields were open. To that we will return in a later talk. But how then do we explain the revival? Well, as a work of God, the Lord acting in history, a providential view of history, certainly. But we cannot deny that there were other factors also and other aspects that played a part in understanding the causes and origins. The revival had many elements in its background, but it cannot be simply explained in human terms. Even the rather unholy battles between Wesley and Whitefield had at their root a contest for Protestantism. Christian historian has a responsibility to assess the whole range of factors which lie behind the outbreak of revival and awakening, including the religious, the political, and the social. Well, the historian John Walsh, in his essay published in 1966 on the origins of the revival, referred to political, doctrinal, ecclesiastical, psychological, social, and economic factors, but also, as the evangelicals themselves saw it, as the providential effusion of the Holy Spirit in the national life. Now, Walsh set out three main categories into which explanations of the revival fall, and I'm just going to run briefly through each of these. The first of these categories was the continuing influence of high church spiritual piety. This may seem slightly surprising, but I will explain it more both now and as we go into the story of Whitefield in more detail. This high church orthodoxy in the period after 1688 had a number of distinctive characteristics. The tradition was not particularly Roman Catholic and not particularly sympathetic to Catholicism. The loyalty of its adherents to the crown was not in doubt. Considerable weight was given to the church. Its heroes were the divines of the Stuart period, Lancelot Andrewes, Jeremy Taylor, and George Herbert, if not so much to the monarchs. Walsh describes their adherence as to apostolic order, continuity, authority, and discipline, the visible church, the necessity of apostolic succession, together with baptism, Eucharist, and liturgical conformity. So actually, although it's easy to see how this might lead to churchiness and arid intellectualism, some of this orthodox background, some of this orthodox quest for a holy life and a desire for spiritual vitality formed part of the background in all of the key players in the revival. Now, the usual example that is given is that of the influence of William Law, born in 1686, died in 1761, and his book, A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life, published in 1729. And this represented the classic high church description of holiness, requiring dedication and discipline of life. And this book certainly influenced both the Wesleys and George Whitefield and other members of the Holy Club in Oxford, whom we will meet in the next talk. So part of the background to the revival, part of the background of explanations to the revival, lies in this rather high church quest for God, a high church quest for a holy life. Now, the second group of explanations saw the outbreak of revival as a reaction against Protestant rationalism, and rather as a protest against arid intellectualism and the perceived cold formality of much of contemporary religiosity. This was reflected, as we've noted in the sermons, long, dry articulations of obscure points of theology. There seemed to be very little for the soul. In many ways, this was a reflection of the age, with the advancement of the Enlightenment in its thinking, and the elevation of the mind and carefully constructed rational argument. Wesley, though, commented that faith is not barely a speculative, rational thing, a cold, lifeless assent, a train of ideas in the head, but also a disposition of the heart. The reaction to rationality was exemplified in the appeal to experience. The third type of explanation emphasised direct continuity with the Puritan tradition, taking its adherents down well-known and recognisable paths with familiar guides. The continuities are many. Despite the ebbs and flows, it is now accepted that throughout the history of the Church of England, a continuing Puritan tradition remained. Hence, the revival can be characterised as Puritanism coming back to life. Certainly, many of the spiritual and doctrinal works that featured in the revival, and indeed in the personal stories of many of the participants, came from the Puritan divines. The classic appeal to the formularies of the Church of England also reflected this approach. The theology of the revival clearly mirrored that of the Reformation, especially so with Whitefield. It is, just as we draw to a close in this explanation of the origins and causes, also just worth noting the importance of international connections. Both international pietism, the Moravian communities that so influenced Wesley, the idea of the possibility of a personal relationship and a personal encounter with God, and also international Calvinism, which provided a channel of communication. So when Jonathan Edwards sought to tell the story of revival in Northampton in 1733-35, a faithful narrative of the surprising work of God, it was two England-based Calvinist dissenters, Isaac Watts and John Guise, who published the work in London. This helped ensure that the revival and Calvinism remained partners. Well, there were also some differences and some complexities with all of these explanations. Whitefield cut through some of the dry, rationalistic, systematic theology of the Puritans to preach and proclaim the new birth. This was a new appeal that gave much more weight to individual experience of the power of the Spirit in the heart than previously. Indeed, in some ways, Whitefield was much more radical, concerned for field preaching, even church planting, although the phraseology is an anachronism, and less so for church order and even doctrinal confessions. The revival can thus be characterised as a religion of the heart, a Protestant awakening, or even a work of God. Had a wide range of social, political, ecclesiastical and psychological aspects. But in essence, the Lord walked the land in new ways, but with the old doctrines, the old faith, and with extraordinary outcomes. The figure of George Whitefield is central to this story.